60-year-old Patricia Eifert was helping her daughter move into a newly purchased home in Garland, Texas, during the summer of 2021 when she was fatally shot by an intruder. She had gone to the residence alone to fix a cabinet when the killer fired multiple bullets into her body. Paramedics pronounced Eifert dead at the scene. Surveillance footage showed a black vehicle with a female behind the wheel and a man in the passenger seat, traveling through an alleyway behind the house at around the time of the murder, which occurred just before 7 in the evening. Later identified as 20-year-old Kevondre Presley and 21-year-old Gabriela Liliana Torres, both of the individuals could be seen exiting the vehicle and entering Eifert's daughter's garage. Just moments later, the suspects exited the garage with several presumably stolen items in their possession and fled the scene. Eifert's murder came just as she was about to start a new chapter in her life. Earlier that day, she had informed her employer that she planned on retiring. Records show that Presley was convicted of capital murder with a firearm and is serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Torres was convicted of a lower-level murder charge and was sentenced to 30 years behind bars. Number 15. Sarah Daniel. 71-year-old William Billy Jackson was so surprised and scared when an intruder burglarized his home in the English town of Washington in September 2021 that he went into cardiac arrest and died. The perpetrator, 34-year-old Sarah Daniel, and her partner, 40-year-old Leanne English, had planned to rob Jackson as well as another vulnerable adult. Jackson suffered from advanced heart disease and diabetes. He also had limited mobility and relied on a scooter in order to get around. In order to support himself, he sold cigarettes and tobacco. Daniel reportedly carried out the crime with a 20-year-old co-conspirator named David Bulmer. Jackson was familiar with Daniel and Bulmer because he occasionally loaned them money, but he refused to continue lending to them when they failed to repay him, resulting in the decision to burglarize his home. A neighbor observed someone leaving the home and tried to chase after them but couldn't keep up. He then entered the residence and found Jackson collapsed on the kitchen floor. He was still clinging to life, but emergency responders were unable to save him. The medical examiner who performed Jackson's autopsy concluded that he would not have suffered a fatal cardiac arrest if he hadn't been subjected to the stressful event of being robbed by a home intruder. Daniel was convicted of manslaughter, conspiracy to commit burglary, aggravated burglary, and 2 counts of fraud. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. English was found guilty of conspiracy to commit burglary and assault, resulted in a 5-year, 5-month prison sentence, while Bulmer was convicted of aggravated burglary and sentenced to 7 years behind bars. Number 14. Justice Chimner and DeWand Estes III. It was in 17-year-old Jack Snyder's nature to be kind, which is why he was quick to offer a ride home to 2 young strangers. In February 2023, he saw the pair of teenagers walking in the cold in Battle Creek, Michigan, while on his way home from school, and stopped to see if they wanted a lift. Later identified as Justice Chimner and DeWand Estes III, the strangers obliged. In fact, the kind offer was perfect for their goal that day, which was to steal a car and then exchange the vehicle for money. Chimney and Estes already had a buyer lined up when Snyder came along, and they wasted no time attempting to carjack the unsuspecting Good Samaritan. One of the carjackers fatally shot Snyder, instantaneously escalating the situation from an attempted carjacking to a murder. Chimney later claimed that he thought Snyder was reaching for a gun when he made the fateful decision to fire 2 bullets using a handgun he had stolen from his mother earlier that day. 6 months later, authorities formally charged Chimner and Estes with Snyder's murder. In October 2024, Estes pleaded guilty to 1 count of carjacking. The murder charge was dropped, and he is currently awaiting sentencing. Chimner's case is scheduled to go to trial in January of 2025. Number 13. Nicholas Nering.
Control 911, where's your emergency?
I need an emergency. Right now, the shooting, the corner store next to Stevie.
Okay, do you know if anyone's been hit?
Troy Days hit. Get an ambulance here. Now! Somebody just shot this kid 3 times.
While responding to a reported shooting in Pensacola, Florida, in November 2015, police officers found a man named Joseph Ross lying on the pavement with multiple gunshot wounds. His friend was trying to revive him with CPR, but he died from his injuries. During the investigation, detectives identified 24-year-old Nicholas Nering as a suspect. While conducting surveillance on Nering's home, officers spotted the young man and his friend, Jerry Lovelace, carrying luggage out to a pickup truck in Nering's driveway. As soon as the pair pulled out of the driveway, police pulled the truck over. Nering and Lovelace were taken down to the police station where Nering confessed to murdering Ross.
Do you have any idea what this is about?
No, I don't know. It's gunpoint, got on the car, got out of the car.
Yeah, but you know what? Anything that you have an idea what led to that?
No.
Now, when you were stopped, you had a couple of guns on you?
Mm-hmm. I was going to the shooting range. I just turned the corner, and the lights went on.
Okay. Is there any reason that your truck would have been at the CVS around the corner from that? You can choose to be deceptive all you want, okay?
I've never seen you on this side of town.
What points it out to you? The thing of this is that you were there because people wrote down the tag number of your truck there, okay?
No, the truck shouldn't have been there. Wasn't my possession.
It was there.
Wasn't my possession.
But you were there.
I wasn't there.
You were.
How do you know that?
Video cameras?
After convincing the victim to meet under the false pretense of selling drugs to Ross, he admitted that he never planned to follow through with the drug deal, that he shot Ross with the intention of killing him, and that he fired several more shots to ensure that Ross was dead, telling the interviewer, "Dead men tell no tales."
No okay? That's straight up honesty. No okay? He deserved it. He reached for nothing. Shot my dog's face. He made a noise. I shot him. No mine. That's it.
Nering even went as far as stating that Ross deserved to die and that he had no regrets. The two men had a contentious past, and Nering claimed that Ross owed him drug money. Despite his confession, Nering told a much different story at trial. He was nevertheless found guilty of first-degree murder and is serving a mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole. As of December 2024, Nering is being held at the Escambia County Jail as he awaits a hearing regarding his attempt to appeal his case. Number 12. Guillermo Humberto Ugere IV. On the evening of July 23, 2022, police responded to a reported shooting at a Safeway gas station in Farmington, New Mexico. A 43-year-old unarmed homeless man named Brandon York had been gunned down in the parking lot in broad daylight and was lying dead on the pavement. Based on witness descriptions of the shooter's vehicle, officers scoured the area until they spotted the suspect's blue Ford Ranger pickup truck. They pulled the truck over and apprehended the driver, 21-year-old Guillermo Humberto Ugere IV, along with his girlfriend and a male passenger. Ugere immediately admitted to shooting York, claiming he had acted in self-defense, and said that his passengers were not involved in the incident. The passengers were questioned and released, and Ugere was taken down to the police station for further questioning. During the interrogation, Ugere claimed that he was trying to recruit homeless people to work for his landscaping business when he got into an altercation with York, who he accused of yelling and throwing rocks at him. This was corroborated by eyewitness accounts, but Ugere was not entirely truthful throughout his conversation with law enforcement. Footage captured by an onlooker showed Ugere firing one shot at York after being hit in the back of the head with a rock. York collapsed onto the ground, which meant that he was no longer a threat to Ugere, who stepped toward York and fired 8 to 9 more shots. Records show that Ugere pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Number 11. Raimundo Estrada. At around 10 p.m. on November 5th, 2020, a young man called 911 in Lee County, Florida, and reported that his girlfriend had been shot. He was unable to provide an exact location, and patrol deputies were dispatched to search for the woman's SUV. They located the vehicle at an intersection where they found 18-year-old Guadalupe Salinas bleeding profusely from a head wound. She had been struck by a single bullet through the driver's side window, but it was evident that multiple gunshots had been fired. Salinas was pronounced dead at the scene. Further investigation revealed that she had been shot about a half mile from where the police found her during a marijuana sale gone wrong. According to court documents, the victims had met up with 2 suspects who approached the passenger side of the vehicle and greeted Salinas' boyfriend. Just moments into what had initially seemed like a friendly exchange, the perpetrators brandished guns and demanded property from the young man, who told Salinas to drive away. Before the couple could try fleeing, one of the robbers opened fire on the vehicle. The suspects fled the scene on foot, and the male victim noticed that Salinas was slumped over in her seat, Fearing for his life, he moved her out of the driver's seat, got behind the wheel and left the scene while calling 911. Investigators identified the suspects as 18-year-old Raimundo Estrada and his friend Christian Browning. During questioning, Browning initially denied any knowledge of the homicide. He later admitted to being present when Estrada shot Salinas, but claimed that he was just there to buy marijuana and was unaware of Estrada's plans to rob the couple. Estrada denied any knowledge of or involvement in the homicide, claiming he was with his child's mother when the crime occurred. But his fingerprints were found on the victim's vehicle and their placement was consistent with Browning's confession. In July of 2022, Estrada pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, attempted robbery, and shooting into an occupied conveyance. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison and is scheduled for release in 2050 at the age of 48. Number 10. Parrish Chambers Jr. On the morning of June 15th, 2022, San Diego police officers found 45-year-old Connie Dadkhah dead inside her home in the Rancho Peñasquitos community. The discovery came 12 hours after 911 calls had started pouring in from neighbors who overheard a violent home invasion occurring at the property. Emergency dispatchers received at least 7 calls over an hour-long period before elevating the urgency of the response. By then, the intruder had climbed onto Dadkhah's balcony and smashed his way in through her glass door. It took another full hour before 2 cops arrived and went to the door. No one answered, and Dadkhah didn't pick up her phone when they tried to call, so they left the scene despite having received reports of a violent confrontation taking place. At 8:30 the next morning, 44-year-old Parrish Chambers Jr. exited Dadkhah's home and told a neighbor to call 911 because the victim was dead. Officers arrived just minutes later and arrested him on suspicion of murder. Chambers was banned by court order from going anywhere near Dadkhah as a condition of his probation for a previous vandalism crime. Dadkhah was also the victim in that incident, which occurred 2 years prior to her murder. Friends who were familiar with the situation told NBC7 that Chambers had been stalking the woman for years after meeting her through a mental health outreach program that she volunteered for. He became obsessed with Dadkhah and pursued her relentlessly, even after she made it clear that she wanted no contact with him. In August 2024, a jury acquitted Chambers of first-degree murder, but found him guilty of 2 counts of simple battery and felony false imprisonment. Jurors failed to reach a consensus on second-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter charges, and the judge declared a mistrial. It remains unclear whether prosecutors plan to retry Chambers on the deadlocked counts. Number 9. Mechele Fournier. 61-year-old Susan Phoenix, Lane-Fournier's employer, reported her missing in Clackamas County, Oregon on November 22nd, 2024, after she failed to show up for work. Believing she had gone on a hike in Mount Hood National Forest with her 2 dogs, law enforcement launched a search effort with help from dozens of volunteers. On the second day of the search, Susan's Ford F-250 pickup truck was found abandoned, but the missing woman herself was nowhere to be found. It was parked in an unusual place for someone who planned to hike the trail that Susan went on that day, and this especially made no sense because she was an experienced hiker. Police called off the search after 4 days due to the worsening weather and the unlikelihood that Susan was still alive. Nearly a week after she vanished, her remains were discovered 4 miles from where her truck had been located. Susan's dogs have not been found. Investigators soon discovered that she had filed for divorce from her husband of 12 years, 71-year-old Mechele Fournier, in late October. On December 1st, authorities announced the arrest of Mechele for second-degree murder. He's been held without bail at the Clackamas County Jail. Authorities have released almost no details about the tragedy, including Susan's cause of death and the suspected nature of Mechele's involvement in it. They've appealed to the public for any information that might be helpful to the case. Number 8. Roniel Perez. In November 2024, the moderately decomposed body of 52-year-old Oscar Rene Hernandez Augustin was found alongside a dirt road in rural Homestead, Florida. He had been stabbed to death and burned from the waist down. Hernandez Augustin had been reported missing 2 days prior to the discovery of his remains. 3 days after his body was found, Miami-Dade police spotted someone driving his car and attempted to pull them over. Later identified as 31-year-old Roniel Perez, the driver refused to pull over and led law enforcement on a brief chase which ended when he crashed into another vehicle. Perez, a Cuban national, tried to flee on foot but was soon found hiding beneath a parked car. In his possession, police found Hernandez Augustin's ID and bank card, which Perez admitted to using multiple times after the victim went missing. Officers found a substantial amount of blood on the back seats of the victim's stolen car, along with several pairs of latex gloves. A search of the suspect's phone turned up photos of the blood evidence, the victim's ID card and credit card, and cuts on Perez's hand. Authorities have yet to reveal a motive for the murder of Hernandez Augustin, who was described by his wife as a kind man who didn't deserve a horrible death. Perez is currently detained in Miami-Dade County on suspicion of second-degree murder with a weapon, grand theft, and other charges. Number 7. Brooks Cleary. On the day after Christmas in 2022, Brooks Cleary told emergency medical responders that his fiancée, 21-year-old Hailey Johnson, had fallen or had a seizure at their apartment in Marietta, Georgia. It was soon discovered that Johnson had actually been shot in the head, and Cleary was later accused of attempting to conceal her injuries along with the shotgun that had inflicted her fatal wound. With investigators unable to determine who fired the deadly shot, the medical examiner's office listed Johnson's manner of death as undetermined. Cleary was charged with concealing the death of another, making false statements, and 2 counts of interference with government property. In March of 2024, a jury found him guilty on all counts. During his sentencing hearing, Cleary testified that he was blackout drunk when the incident occurred. He claimed not to remember hiding the shotgun under a pile of clothing and sitting on top of it, but that he only recalled trying to get Johnson to respond and frantically telling someone to call 911. Cleary was sentenced to 11 years in prison, including 1 year for the concealment of death charge, which carries a 10-year maximum, and 10 years for the rest of the charges. It was a far cry from justice to Johnson's family, who have believed all along that there's far more to the story than the defendant was willing to admit to. Number 6. Ronnie Adrian J. Towns. In January 2015, 69-year-old El Ray Bud Runion and his wife of 38 years, 66-year-old June Runion, drove 3 hours from their home in Cobb County, Georgia, to Telfair County to buy a 1966 Ford Mustang they had seen for sale on Facebook Marketplace. 4 days later, the couple was found murdered in their submerged car, which had been found in a lake. They had both been shot to death. Phone records showed that the last person Bud and June had contact with was 28-year-old Ronnie Adrian J. Towns, the man who had advertised the classic car for sale. As it turned out, he didn't really own a vintage Mustang. After learning that he was wanted in connection with the double homicide, he turned himself in. Towns pleaded not guilty to murder and other charges, while prosecutors accused him of luring the victims to their deaths in a diabolical robbery scheme. Over the next 9 years, the case hit several snags, which caused it to drag on for far longer than most criminal cases. The original indictment was thrown out due to a grand jury selection problem, and the court proceedings were further delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Additionally, prosecutors were seeking the death penalty, which inevitably leads to a longer court process. The case was still dragging its heels in April 2024 when a magnet fisher found the murder weapon, along with a bag containing the Runion's IDs, credit cards, and cell phone. In November, Towns pleaded guilty to 2 murder charges in exchange for life without parole, sparing him from death row. Number 5. Michael LaFlex. 23-year-old Bryce Brogle was reported missing in Crow Wing County, Minnesota, in October 2022 by his girlfriend Cordelia LaFlex, who told police that he had gone to meet up with her father at a storage unit 2 days earlier and never returned. During police questioning, Cordelia's father, 43-year-old Michael Lee LaFlex, claimed that Brogle had been arrested by unnamed law enforcement officers during their visit to the storage unit. He told detectives that the officers had approached in unmarked police cars with the lights flashing, and that Brogle was placed into the back seat of one of the vehicles and driven away. Investigators ultimately determined that this was a lie. During the investigation, Cordelia's landlord told detectives that LaFlex had recently called him and asked if Brogle had hurt his daughter. The landlord told LaFlex that he had seen Cordelia with 2 black eyes. In response, LaFlex allegedly stated his intention to kill Brogle, claiming that he had already dug a grave. A concerned relative also came forward telling investigators that LaFlex had admitted to shooting Brogle and had told them the body wouldn't be found because it was buried. While searching the storage unit, police found bleach and evidence of blood. 4 days after Brogle disappeared, his remains were found in a makeshift grave near the storage unit. He had been shot in the back of the head, and LaFlex was charged with murder. Text messages and other evidence revealed that Cordelia had no involvement in the crime, and she was devastated by the death of her partner. On the evening of Brogle's murder, she had become both impatient and concerned when he went radio silent and failed to return home. In April 2024, a jury found LaFlex guilty of first and second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and fined nearly $15,000. Number 4. Ju Bin Wang. On October 22nd, 2020, 40-year-old Dr. Li Jun Xuan and his wife, 41-year-old Jiang Jiang Wu, were attacked by their knife-wielding tenant at their Auburn, Alabama home. Dr. Xuan died from his injuries that day, and Wu passed away several months later in February 2021. The suspect, 21-year-old Ju Bin Wang, had been renting a room from the couple while attending Auburn University as a foreign exchange student. They had experienced some sort of disagreement over Wang's lease, prompting him to summon an Uber to their neighborhood intent on seeking revenge. Wang had the Uber driver drop him off away from the home, then trekked through a wooded area to get there. He stabbed both victims dozens of times while the couple's children hid. Wu yelled at her kids to run, and they were spared from becoming the killer's next victims. Following the discovery of Xuan and Wu's bodies, authorities charged Wang with 5 counts of capital murder, including 2 counts of capital murder during a burglary, capital murder in front of the children, and capital murder of 2 or more persons in a common scheme. In November 2024, he was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life without parole. Number 3. Marquis Green. In October 2024, police performed a welfare check at the Lawrenceville, Georgia home of 60-year-old Robert Terry, at the request of his relatives, who hadn't heard from him in several weeks. As officers approached the front door, they were hit by an overwhelming stench coming from inside. Through a window, they could see trash and feces on the floor. While inside the home, the officers entered the laundry room and saw what appeared to be a decomposing human foot beneath a tarp. The discovery of Terry's body followed, and while the authorities have not revealed his cause of death, the case has been ruled a homicide. Over the following days, someone was seen driving around in Terry's vehicle and withdrawing tens of thousands of dollars from his bank accounts. Police arrested the suspect, 27-year-old Marquis Green of Alabama, who they say had some sort of business relationship with the victim. Authorities believe Terry's murder was financially motivated, and prosecutors have charged Green with a slew of crimes including felony murder, aggravated assault, concealing the death of another, aggravated cruelty to animals, armed robbery, 3 counts of theft by taking, identity fraud, and computer forgery. He remains held without bail at the Gwinnett County Jail amid the ongoing case.
As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe, and maybe it will be your video that we'll be doing next.
Number 2. Brian Anthony Rodden. On July 3rd, 2021, 41-year-old Gene Siller was shot execution-style outside the Pine Tree Country Club in Cobb County, Georgia, where he worked as a manager. In a pickup truck nearby, police also found the murdered bodies of Paul Pearson and Henry Valdez. A suspect, later identified as Brian Anthony Rodden, was seen driving onto the golf course in the truck containing the bodies of Pearson and Valdez. Rodden fled the scene and was picked up 25 miles away several days later. According to authorities, Siller was killed simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had seen Rodden near the bodies of Pearson and Valdez, prompting Rodden to eliminate him as a witness. On the day of the shootings, Pearson had been instructed to bring marijuana to a meeting between Rodden and Valdez at an auto shop. During the interaction, Rodden took Pearson and Valdez captive using zip ties and duct tape. He forced the men into the back of Pearson's pickup truck, then abandoned the vehicle at the golf course. Prosecutors planned to pursue the death penalty, but in 2024, Rodden pleaded guilty to 17 crimes, including 7 counts of felony murder, 3 counts of malice murder, 3 counts of aggravated assault, tampering with evidence, and 2 counts of kidnapping with bodily injury. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. We will line up our release about 7 people who successfully appealed life sentences right after number 1. Unlike the people in today's episode, those people did not have it coming, but still got punished. Number 1. Daniel Krug. On December 14th, 2023, police in Broomfield, Colorado, performed a welfare check at the request of 43-year-old Daniel Bartholomew Krug. Upon arriving at the scene, officers found Daniel's wife, 43-year-old Crystal Krug, clinging to life in the garage with blunt force injuries and a stab wound, which she would later die from at the hospital. There were no signs of forced entry or a struggle, and Crystal's concealed carry gun was found on her person, indicating that she had been ambushed or that she knew her killer. 2 days later, Daniel was arrested on suspicion of murder. In the year leading up to Crystal's death, someone claiming to be her ex-boyfriend had bombarded her with harassing and threatening emails and text messages. The person sent details about Crystal's routine and activities, making it seem like she was being followed. Crystal reported the unwanted correspondence to the police, noting that she and her ex had split up 23 years ago and stating that the deluge of harassment seemed unusual. After Crystal's murder, investigators traced the messages to Daniel's workplace Wi-Fi, leading to the suspicion that he had tried to frame his wife's ex for the crime. Additionally, Daniel had no explanation for why his household's security cameras were conveniently turned off on the day of the murder. Authorities' suspicions grew when they spoke with Crystal's mother, who said that her daughter was planning to divorce Daniel and pursue full custody of their children. They were also able to clear Crystal's ex-boyfriend of any wrongdoing, making Daniel the sole suspect in the case. Daniel is facing charges of murder, stalking, and criminal impersonation. He remains in custody on a $5 million bond as he awaits trial, which is scheduled for February 2025. Number 7. Mechele Linehan. Alaska woman Mechele Linehan first met Kent LePink in the early 1990s at the Gentleman's Club, where she worked as an exotic dancer. The pair were romantically involved until May of 1996, when 36-year-old LePink was found dead in the former gold mining town of Hope, with 3 .44 caliber Desert Eagle gunshot wounds. In the wake of his death, suspicions immediately fell upon Linehan and her boyfriend, John Carlin, who were accused of orchestrating the shooting as a way of gaining access to the victim's $1 million life insurance policy. A few days before his death, LePink had changed the beneficiary on the policy, citing concerns he developed about the intentions of his girlfriend and her lover. In October of 2007, Linehan and Carlin were convicted of LePink's murder and consequently jailed for life. However, following a series of petitions for the convictions to be overturned, the Alaska Court of Appeals eventually dismissed the guilty verdicts in 2010, although Carlin died before he could be released. The court reportedly concluded that 2 pieces of evidence that had been prominently featured during the original murder trial shouldn't have been admissible in the first place. Testimony that Linehan had modeled her murder plot after the 1994 film The Last Seduction because she admired the main character was identified as one of the improper court submissions. The other was a letter the victim had penned to his parents, in which he stated that if he were to die under suspicious circumstances, Linehan would be the culprit. The man had further urged his parents to take Mechele down and make sure she is prosecuted. Alaska prosecutors ultimately decided not to indict Linehan a second time, and she was thus allowed to walk free. As of the latest updates on the matter, the exonerated woman had moved to Tacoma, Washington, where she began operating a laser clinic. Number 6. Kenneth Oliver. In 1996, California man Kenneth Oliver was sentenced to life in prison on a joyriding conviction under the state's 3-strike sentencing law for repeat felons. At the age of 16, Oliver had faced criminal charges in connection to his alleged role in an armed robbery. He was later arrested again while a passenger in a stolen vehicle, and a stolen handgun was also found in his hotel room. The joyriding incident was the latest in a string of crimes that led to him being sent to prison for life. Oliver was also ordered to serve 8 years in solitary confinement because he was found to be in possession of purported gang materials, including a book written by Black Guerrilla Family co-founder George Jackson, just days before he died during a violent escape attempt from San Quentin State Prison. It was Oliver's possession of this book that made him ineligible for resentencing, even after the 3 strikes law was amended to allow life sentences only when the third offense is a violent felony. The man spent a total of 23 years behind bars before he finally broke ground in his attempts to appeal his sentence. In the summer of 2019, the California Corrections Department expunged Oliver's supposed gang affiliation from his official record, paying him a $125,000 settlement for his years in solitary. It was reported that following the man's subsequent release from prison, he made plans to become a paralegal, helping others through social justice programs while reconnecting with his 3 adult children. Number 5. Cyntoia Brown. On the night of August the 6th of 2004, Cyntoia Brown met with 43-year-old Johnny Michael Allen in the parking lot of a Sonic drive-in in Nashville, Tennessee. Brown, who was 16 at the time, reportedly accompanied the man back to his home, where she agreed to have intercourse with him in exchange for $150. Before the intimate encounter occurred, however, Brown became concerned that Allen might try to harm her. She thought he was reaching for a weapon, which prompted her to brandish a firearm of her own and shoot him in the back of the head. The teen subsequently pilfered $172 from the man's wallet and a pair of his handguns, then fled the scene. During the ensuing criminal trial, prosecutors accused Brown of gunning Allen down as part of a premeditated plan to rob him, while she maintained that she'd been acting in self-defense. Brown was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder, felony murder, and aggravated robbery, and was consequently sent to prison for life, despite her status as a juvenile offender. Upon launching a fierce campaign to appeal her conviction, Brown revealed that she'd been trapped in an abusive relationship with a drug dealer at the time of the incident, and had been forced into a life of prostitution. Criminal justice reform activists thus began using the case as an example of a teenage human trafficking victim who was unreasonably incarcerated for acting in the interest of self-preservation. In 2019, Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam commuted Brown's sentence to 15 years plus 10 years of probation. Having already served 15 years, the woman was released. She and her husband subsequently founded the J-Fam Foundation, which aims to empower individuals who are at risk of exploitation or criminal justice system involvement. Number 4. Alvin Kennard. 22-year-old Alvin Kennard was arrested in 1983 for robbing Highlands Bakery in Bessemer, Alabama. The young man reportedly held the establishment up with a pocket knife before making off with just $50.75 in stolen cash. Despite the measly return, Kennard was charged with first-degree robbery after being taken into custody in the aftermath. According to subsequent reports, the 1983 arrest marked the second time Kennard had been busted for robbery in his young adult life. Back in 1979, he pled guilty to 3 counts of second-degree robbery in connection to a break-in at an unoccupied gas station. For his latest criminal exploits, Kennard was ultimately imprisoned for life after being sentenced under Alabama's Habitual Felony Offender Act, which at the time could trigger lifetime sentences depending on a defendant's criminal history. Under sentencing guidelines enacted after his incarceration, Kennard would have only received a maximum of 21 years, as per court records. Nevertheless, the man spent the next 36 years behind bars before an appeal of his conviction was finally successful. At a hearing in August of 2019, Kennard was resentenced to time served and was released shortly thereafter. During his resentencing hearing, Kennard, who'd by that time turned 58, said to the court, "I take responsibility for what I did in the past. I want the opportunity to get it right." Number 3. Terrence Gangsta Williams. After serving more than 20 years of a life sentence, Terrence "Gangsta" Williams, was unexpectedly released from prison in January of 2022. Williams, the half-brother of Cash Money Records founder Brian "Birdman" Williams, had initially been arrested following an FBI investigation into his illicit activities as a member of the Hot Boys gang. He was accused of plotting to kill a group of New York drug dealers, which federal investigators learned via wiretaps. The man pleaded guilty to engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise and solicitation of murder, resulting in his life sentence. Over the course of subsequent years, Williams was said to have begun cooperating with the authorities in securing guilty pleas from co-defendants. Although the circumstances surrounding Williams's eventual release weren't made clear, it's been suggested that it was the substantial assistance he reportedly provided law enforcement while incarcerated that precipitated his life term being reduced to just 27.5 years upon appeal. Number 2. Kendall Gordon. In 2010, New Orleans teen Kendall Gordon stood trial for the murder of Patrice Commodore on August the 8th of 2009. The latter had been shot in the head by a pair of bandana-clad robbers, one old and one young, who made off with $200. One of the assailants, identified as 18-year-old Jesse Bibbins, was later found dead from a gunshot wound to the neck he'd sustained during the home invasion. In the incident's immediate aftermath, eyewitness Darceline Commodore told the police that she believed 19-year-old Kendall Gordon to have been the younger gunman involved. Upon learning that it was Bibbins who'd sustained injuries in the shooting, however, Commodore recanted her identification of Gordon, who was nevertheless arrested and brought to trial on a second-degree murder charge. Throughout the court proceedings, Commodore repeatedly admitted to having been mistaken about Gordon's involvement in the crime. Orleans Parish District Judge Frank Marullo Jr. stated that he believed Commodore had recanted her original identification of Gordon because she feared for her safety. The defendant was ultimately convicted of the murder and given a life sentence with no chance of parole. His initial attempts to appeal the guilty verdict proved unsuccessful. However, after partnering with the New Orleans chapter of the Innocence Project, Gordon petitioned for the Forensic Analytical Crime Lab to perform further testing on DNA evidence found at the crime scene. In doing so, investigators excluded Gordon as a possible contributor to the DNA mixtures recovered, and the young man's defense team thus motioned for his conviction to be vacated. The motion was granted in December of 2021, and Gordon was liberated after erroneously serving 12 years behind bars. Number 1. William Allen. In 1994, when Massachusetts resident William Allen was in his early 20s, he took part in a violent robbery that culminated in the fatal stabbing of Purvis Bester in Brockton. Although it was Allen's accomplice who'd committed the killing, both men subsequently faced murder charges in connection to the incident. Allen refused to plead guilty to the charges, citing the fact that he hadn't been the one to attack Bester on the night of his death. It was the young man's unwillingness to take a plea deal that led to him being automatically sentenced to life without parole following his eventual conviction. Prosecutors had taken advantage of a former Massachusetts law which stipulated that a defendant who participated in a deadly crime but played no role in the murder itself could still be punished as harshly as the actual killer. This particular legislation was amended in 2017 after the state Supreme Judicial Court ruled that a person who didn't kill couldn't be charged with first-degree murder. Following the change in the law, Allen attempted to appeal his conviction and was supported in his efforts by a number of prominent Massachusetts figures, including New England Patriots player Devin McCourty and Plymouth County District Attorney Tim Cruz. In May of 2022, after Allen had spent nearly 28 years locked up, he was finally released. The Governor's Council had unanimously approved commuting the man's conviction to second-degree murder, thus making him eligible for parole. In the wake of Allen's highly publicized release, many were quick to note a darkly ironic aspect of the case. The man who'd actually stabbed Purvis Bester back in 1994 was freed on parole more than a decade before Allen's eventual release because he'd pleaded guilty to his original charges. Thanks for watching. If you could choose between going to heaven or living eternally on $10 million a year, which would you choose and why? Let us know in the comments section below.